Hello, it's Amy, and I'm here with the next chapter of A London Book Window by James Milne. And today's chapter is very appropriate for October, for the month of Victober, where many people here on BookTube on YouTube read Victorian literature, because today's chapter is titled Were the Victorians Dull? And I would suspect that Milne is about to argue that no, they were not dull. Were the Victorians dull? Did you happen to hear a smart little story which was told about Mr. Lytton Strachey and his now famous study of Queen Victoria? It was that he said, "I'll take a flat opposite the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens in order to write it." Most likely he never threatened anything of the sort, because our younger authors never think or do half the bold, original things attributed to them. The moral here, however, was that, looking out on the Albert Memorial, he would be in constant touch with all that Victorianism was supposed to represent, a general dowdiness, if I may thus summarize the charge. Queen Victoria reigned so long that she almost became a pillar of the Constitution, nay, a pillar of the world. She came, as it were, to stand for a great period of settledness, of quiet, gradual progress, of doubt, but also of convention. A smooth stream always runs deep, and in half a century it may make a wholly new course, though day by day, week by week, month by month, and even year by year, this would hardly be apparent to the eye. We know now that the England of Queen Victoria's coming to the throne and the England of her death were so different that the one would scarcely recognize the other. But yet, when the 20th century cracked along, laden with all kinds of new ideas, plans, and achievements, people fell into the habit of turning up their noses at the Victorians. Yes, it was said loftily, it was an age of crinolines and of snug commercialism and laissez-faire. But when a young man sure of himself and his time steps into the shoes of an old man who perhaps has ceased to be sure of himself or his time, there is apt to be this cleverness, this belittling of what has been. By and by there is a reaction, for always any strain brings a rebound, and it soon began to show itself about Victorianism. Was it so cribbed, cabined, and confined as some people thought it? Was an age which lost the stagecoat, hoop petticoats, and tight trousers, and gained railway trains, fast steamships, and the electric telegraph really so dull and commonplace as youth in the 20th century regarded it? Was a half-century which knew great novelists like Dickens and Thackeray, poets like Tennyson and Browning, statesmen like Disney and Gladstone, a dozen lawyers, journalists, artists, and actors of eminent, beyond doubt, a half-century to be dismissed with a shrug and the remark, "We do better and we know better today." Such a reflection upon the Victorian age has already, in most folk, given place to a true estimate of its greatness for England and for the world. And when everything is said for the well-being of mankind, we see definitely what some of the Victorians were prophets enough to claim in advance, that theirs was a time linkable for its riches with that of the Elizabethans. A constant outcoming of Victorian memoirs, headed by the letters of Queen Victoria herself, has been a strong force in making young England of the 20th century realize that old England of the 19th century, old England of the 19th century really was. Those memoirs have been rich, sometimes also rare, and it is to the credit of our rising generation that it has been willing to read them with an open, receptive mind. Yes, Victorian England was great in material advances, still greater perhaps in some of the arts, certainly in literature. All this is definitely conceded, as willingly or unwillingly it had to be, but one curious and serious doubt remains. Were people in the Victorian age happy? Weren't their lives restricted and narrow? Didn't they, in a word, live in days which, for all the lights there was in them, might have been nights? Here I am thinking of the inquiry suggested by Victorian memoirs to close and critical readers. It is not, please note, an affair of the masses, of the people, but of the upper class and the cultured classes. They produce the memoirs, and they are to be judged by them. Well, evidence as to the well-being of the masses comes from other sources. How the masses have risen in everything desirable since Victoria ascended the throne, we all know, and it is a universal rejoicing. Also, the upper classes have broadened in many manners and tolerances. their resembling democracy. But need this prove that in Victoria's day they lacked the satisfaction and joys of life? With this, let us make a direct appeal to some of the recent Victorian memoirs, in order that their testimony may be consulted and sampled. Quite a group of likely books leaps to the mind. The late Canon Anger's Memoirs of Eton, the Letters from England of an American Mrs. Bancroft, Miss Betham Edwards' mid-Victorian memoirs, and Lord Ronald Gore's old diaries. Again, one thinks of Mr. R.C. Lehman's Memoirs of Half a Century, and Mr. Locker Lampson's My Confidences, of Lady Frances Shelley's Diary, of Professor Knight's Retrospects, of Mrs. Earle's Memoirs and Memories, or of Sir Edward Clarke's Story of My Life. The library of Victorian memoirs issued with an easy memory is quite large, for it also includes Sir Algernon West's Recollections, Madame Waddington's Letters of a Diplomat's Wife, and, if you are interested in parliamentary affairs, Sir Henry Lucy's Long Diary of a Journalist. There is an endless stream of Victorian memories and memoirs, diaries and journals, at which we Georgians, like the Edwardians of a decade back, can refresh ourselves, yes, and vastly instruct ourselves. And by Georgians here, I'm assuming that he's referring to King George. And so I guess, for a period of time, people living under the reign of King George could perhaps refer to themselves as Georgians. I think it's a very different way of looking at eras. We talk about the Victorian period and the Edwardian period, but for the most part, I think that's really the last era, the last monarch where people really identified the period with that monarch. Because I don't think we ourselves would ever refer to ourselves as Elizabethans, as here we are under the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. I would never refer to myself as an Elizabethan. Perhaps that's only because we associate the Elizabethan era with Elizabeth I. Or perhaps it's just sort of a broader, more globalized view of the world now. But moving on, endless stream of memoirs. Yes, and vastly instruct ourselves. It is not possible to read them all, and bearing this in mind, I have made a special choice of 3 of the newest and best, all recently from the House of Murray, which has stood very specifically or specially for English memoirs such as we are studying. They are 51 Years of Victorian Life by the Dowager Countess of Jersey, A Romance of the 19th Century by Colonel Dudley Ward, and Lady Rose Weigel by her daughter, Miss Rachel Weigel. What we have to consult them about is very simple, and the kind of life which was Victorian, early, middle, or later, and whether, when we get down to the confidences of those who lived and knew, it was in the least dull or contracted, or what a Georgian maiden of this whistling 20th century would call stupid. Georgian maidens are not stupid, and indeed they see so clearly with their bright eyes that they find it hard to sympathize with the sight of their grandmothers. Nay, they even seem to have senses and feelings of which their grandmothers knew nothing, and that makes them a trifle uncanny. People, writes Lady Jersey, are apt to talk and write as if early Victorian and mid-Victorian children were kept under strict control and made to treat their elders with respectful awe. I cannot recall any undue restraint in our case. Our mother was an influence which no one would have attempted to resist, but she never interfered with any reasonable happiness or amusement. Our father was the most cheerful of companions, loving to take us about to any kind of sights or entertainment which offered, and buying us toys and presents on every possible occasion. You see, they are mother and father very much as if they would be today, and as fathers and mothers always have been and will be, loving and seeking the happiness of their little folk. The only constraint put upon us, adds Lady Jersey, which is not often used with the modern child, concerned religious observance. We had to come in to daily prayers at 10 o'clock, even if it interfered with working in our gardens or other outdoor amusement, and church twice on Sundays was the invariable rule. She was made to learn any number of chapters and hymns, and scripture catechisms, not to speak of the 39 Articles. When her mother and governess failed to find enough of these sweet exercises for her, they turned her on to Thomas à Kempis, and she survived. It is clear, therefore, that the Victorian child was well grounded in religion, as to which Lady Jersey says, "On the whole, I feel sure that the advantage of acquiring so many great truths, generally in beautiful language, far outweighed any passing irritation that a young girl may have felt with these religious obligations." We know what dancing is like today, or perhaps we don't know, and still, as the soldiers used to say, carry on. Naturally, anyhow, we are interested in hearing from Lady Jersey that in her early days there was still a sort of question as to the propriety of waltzing. She tells us that valses and square dances were danced alternately at balls, and a few, but very few, girls were limited to the latter. Chaperones, who have now in effect disappeared like the dodo, were almost a law of the early Victorian social world, certainly a rule of correctness. Girls went back to them between dances, and it was not until later that sitting out became a custom. We shall test the Victorian age in another way in Colonel Dudley Ward's Romance of the 19th Century, for it is largely a book of love letters. How did nice, well-bred, gently born folk make love about the time of Waterloo, which may be called the military salute to the coming of Victoria and all her reign stood for? There is a charming answer in many epistles exchanged between the Reverend George Brett and Dorothy Best before they became a devoted and happy man and wife. She was a better letter writer and perhaps a better lover than he was, but always they got on quite well, allowing for the conventions of their time. George was rather slow to overcome them, but knowing that was all, she sets out to tell you how truly I feel your tender professions of love to me, and how much it will ever be my steady to preserve your affection. To make your happiness through life will be ever my first wish. Believe that to hear from you is my greatest comfort when absent. No doubt cheap postage, the telegraph, and especially the telephone, have made way with the fine round-handedness which belonged to early Victorian love letters. What is that, however, but a loss to sweethearts? So why lampoon Victorianism? Was it, George Brett wrote, possible to increase the affection I feel towards you? It would certainly be augmented by the very kind and handsome manner in which you immediately answered a message, which I am ashamed to say I conveyed to you in a very slovenly way. And I think I need a sip of my tea here. I conveyed it to you in a very slovenly way. I assure you, your letter poured balm into the breast of the venerable old lady, my mamma, whose spirits previously were very low, through indisposition. George was in much better form when, remembering the counsel of an eminent lord about letters, he said, "Embellishments of style imply steady and deep thought, which give a stiff and formal character to letters. One discomposure of the auburn tresses on your forehead conveys more delight from the natural ease and freedom of sentiment than a folio of studied phrases and deep thought expressions. We are more advanced, more natural anyhow, when we come to the second love correspondence in Colonel Dudley Ward's book, that of Balliol Brett, who became a master of the rolls, and first Viscount Esher, and Eugenie Mayer, his wife. They met in the late 40s of the last century, and straightway he fell in love with her dark beauty and her brilliant mind. Day and night he addressed her, "I have no thought, however dull and ugly in itself, through which the thoughts of you, which never leave me, do not twine like roses through an arbor, and render it beautiful by the excess of their beauty." He loved her in 1,000 ways for 1,000 things, and I long with the most passionate eagerness for the day when I may press you to my heart in full security that you are indeed my wife. Eugene was colder, or perhaps only as became a woman, more reserved to begin with, but soon her heart warmed into a flame. She did not want money in a husband, but she did not want to see him succeed. She did not want money in a husband, but she did want to see him succeed in his profession. And when gladly taking all risks, they married, she wrote, "Never fear for one instant that your little wife can love you less. Her life is so entirely yours that nothing can happen to give you one little cloud in what you call heaven. Love you I always will, and my only wish when I leave your arms will be to return to them, to repeat always, always, I love you." One wonders whether, in our very up-to-date days, we have preserved the art of love letters with that richness and beauty. If not, the point is one in favor of the Victorians, who, when they liked, at least knew how to express themselves. And there is many a token of this in our third Victorian witness, the Memoirs of Lady Rose Weigel. She was the last survivor of the intimate friends of the Duke of Wellington, and her life story gives us many glimpses of him. He no doubt was regarded as the great Victorian, though indeed his name and fame had been won before the young daughter of the Duchess of Kent trod the throne. At the same time, he is only one of many great Victorians that find mention in the friendships of Lady Rose Weigel, whose girlhood implied serious studies and the memory of them. She went in for good reading and for making copious extracts on books and their characters, seasoning them with her own observations and comments. This wisdom, gathered and original, she put into yearly journals, to which she also confided the ideas and thoughts suggested by her daily life. Probably our Georgian girls do not keep diaries in the same serious, highbrow fashion, and that may be a loss for them to us and to those who will come later. If Lady Rose Weigel had been neglectful, we should not have had the entry, "Nothing can be less prepossessing than Dickens' appearance." His action is not graceful, his voice is not musical and rather hoarse, and yet he moves masses of people of all ages and of all kinds alternately to tears and laughter to a degree I never saw equaled. Nor should we have a precious paragraph about rugged Scottish Thomas Carlyle and his brilliant wife, Jane Welsh Carlyle. She said to somebody in her burring Scottish accent that Carlyle, like all men, is a fidget about everything. But when he sits of an evening smoking and begins a denunciation of everything, commencing with the universe and ending with a pair of shoes, I just sit still, and when he has done, I say, "Yes, my dear, it's all very true, and now we'd better go to bed." Is there, half a century later, any better way of managing a husband laden with genius, like Thomas Carlyle, or any husband whatever? And if that be so, does it not suggest that humanly as well as generally, the Victorians, great and small, knew their way about, and as we would now say, they were in their blood and brains, minds and manners, joys and griefs of the time, which was their time. It influenced them, and they molded it by large deeds and large personalities. And when next any of us thinks to belittle the Victorian age, let all that be remembered. And so that is the end of the chapter on Were the Victorians Dull? And so Milne's conclusion that they perhaps were not dull, and that there were many, many things to recommend in their era. And so that is that. The next chapter is titled The Diary in English Letters.